Personally, the species I like to hear about the most are the ones that are shrouded in mystery. Animals said to have been encountered long ago, but whose identity today has proven difficult to determine. Animals that are so rare and so elusive, they've managed to remain undetected by the world, living quiet lives in tiny, remote ranges. In this video, we're exploring 3 incredible mysteries about disputed species. We'll hear the evidence both for and against their existence, and I'll leave you to come to your own conclusions about each of them. The jury is still out on all 3, so let's take a look at their stories. In 1927, a German merchant named Lorenz Hagenbeck was in Buenos Aires, Argentina, looking for animals to bring back to Europe to fill zoos. He met with an animal dealer who had in his possession 3 pelts of an animal that he claimed was a species of wild dog from the Andes Mountains. The largest species of canine from South America is the maned wolf, and while these pelts also seemed to have longer hair around the neck, they differed in several key ways. For one, the pelts were bigger, about 25% larger than maned wolves, measuring around 5 feet long. The hair was also a totally different color, being a dark gray or black overall, and slightly lighter on the belly. The ears were smaller than those of maned wolves, and the snouts seemed to be wider. And they also didn't have the same proportions as maned wolves, having shorter legs and stockier bodies. Hagenbeck purchased one of the pelts and brought it back to Europe with him. Several biologists from different museums examined the pelt, but couldn't really determine what it was. Was it a new species of canine, or was it simply the skin of a domestic dog? Without the rest of the body, it seemed impossible to tell. So it eventually ended up in Munich, where it sat ignored. That is, until German mammologist Ingo Krumbiegel came along in 1940. He had 2 pieces of evidence at hand that he felt were strong proof that the pelt in question was in fact a new species of wild dog. One was the fact that Hagenbeck didn't claim to have just acquired a single pelt, but to have also seen 2 other pelts that matched the same description. More specimens meant that it was more likely that an actual species of animal was being dealt with. Second was a discovery he himself made 5 years prior. In 1935, Krumbiegel had examined a rather confusing canine skull from South America. It was larger than the skull of a maned wolf, and it was reportedly obtained from outside of the known range of the maned wolf. Armed with both pieces of evidence, he described the Andean wolf as a new species, even placing it in a new genus, Dasycyon hagenbecki. Other mammalogists and zoologists supported his finding, but many disagreed. How could Krumbiegel be certain that the skull was from the same animal as the skin? And while Hagenbeck claimed to have seen other skins, they weren't in his possession, and only the one was held in European collections. Surely this wasn't enough data to accept the species as valid. In 1954, German mammologist Fritz Dieterlen performed a close examination of some of the hairs from the pelt and compared them to the German Shepherd breed of domestic dog. He concluded that the 2 were the same, and that the Andean wolf was most likely the skin of a domesticated dog. In the year 2000, after DNA testing became available, genetic testing was done on the pelt to try to determine what it was once and for all. Unfortunately, the pelt was too contaminated to deliver a reliable result, with human, dog, wolf, and pig DNA all being present. Today, the species is not considered valid, and the skin remains sitting in Munich's Zoological Museum. In 1978, the discovery of a manuscript would bring to light the story of a mysterious species of shrew. The manuscript was for an unfinished work, titled Nouveau Voyage aux Indes, or New Voyage to India in English, and was written by French naturalist Pierre Sonnerat. Sonnerat was not just a naturalist, but also a French colonial administrator, and at the end of the 18th century and beginning of the 19th, he spent a lot of time traveling through French territories in Asia, especially India and Ceylon, today known as Sri Lanka. From 1786 until 1813, he was in southern India working on writing his third work about his travels. But in early 1814, he died unexpectedly in Paris at the age of 65, unable to finish his final work. The manuscript for Nouveau Voyage aux Indes disappeared for 164 years before turning up in a rather unexpected place, Sydney, Australia. Somehow it made its way into the collections of the Mitchell Library, and how it got there, no one really knows. The manuscript was in French and contained descriptions of all of the different animals that Sonnerat came across in his travels through India and Sri Lanka. Most of these species were already known to science, but the manuscript also contained a small section with animals that Sonnerat believed were new to science, and one of those animals was a very distinctive species of shrew. After discussing his encounters with the well-known Asian house shrew, which he called rat musqué in French, he wrote, "One sometimes encounters with these rat musqué a particular species that has all the characters of a shrew, but it does not generate a smell of musk. It is also larger, shiny black with a white band on the middle of the body." Later he writes, "This shrew is 5.5 inches from the head to the base of the tail. The tail is 1 inch 1 line in length. The eyes are almost imperceptible and appear only as 2 little black points. It is entirely a handsome black, with a transverse white band across the middle of the body. All its fur is silky. The female is smaller and has the same transverse white band. But all that is black in the male is a clear gray in the female. This shrew has the shape and all the characters of the rat musqué, but it never inhabits houses like it does, nor does it give off any musky smell. It is also larger. It stays hidden during the day in holes, and only appears at night to seek food. I found it in fields a few leagues from Pondicherry." Along with his written description, he included a rough sketch of the shrews that he encountered, and added a few notes to the drawings, including the fact that it has 5 digits on each foot and 2 long incisor teeth. There were a few things about the shrew that made it stand out. One was its location. While in some cases Sonnerat discussed animals that had been brought to him from afar, including a parrot that had been taken to India from Malaysia, he always made mention when the animal wasn't found in nature. He also discussed seeing a red-headed bunting outside of the season when the species would normally be found in India, admitting that the bird had been caged. So he is considered to give reliable accounts of the species he encountered, and the shrew was said to be found in fields within about 10 kilometers from the city of Pondicherry, today known as Puducherry. So we have every reason to trust this account. Also of significance was the shrew's size. He clearly described it as being larger than the Asian house shrew, the largest species of shrew known from India today. Being so large, it would be difficult to confuse with any other species of shrew. But most remarkable is the shrew's coloration. Having distinct white patches on the fur is very rare among shrews. In fact, only one other species in the world is known to have similar fur patterns, the piebald shrew of Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. No species of shrew in either India or Sri Lanka is known to have such distinctive fur patterning, making it seem very unlikely that Sonnerat had simply confused it with another species from the region. An independent researcher from the UK named Anthony Check was asked in 2010 to investigate the species and tried to come up with an explanation. After his analysis of the description of the shrew, a comparison to other known species, and an analysis of Sonnerat's character and credibility, he concluded that the animal from the manuscript should be described as a new species, and he assigned it the epithet Diplomesodon sonnerati, placing it in the same genus as the piebald shrew of Central Asia. The common name assigned to the species in English is Sonnerat's shrew, and if it did in fact exist, it would be the largest species of shrew in the world. Despite his analysis, many other researchers refused to accept the species as legitimate. Without a specimen, and working only off of some scant descriptions and a single drawing, how could a new species be described? And even if it is likely to be a legitimate species, placing it in a genus is almost impossible without a specimen. The status of Sonnerat's shrew remains highly contested, not only taxonomically, but also its conservation status. Most feel that the species is most likely already extinct, with its probably tiny range having already been consumed by the urban sprawl of Puducherry. Others, like Czech himself, feel that it may well still be out there, living in undisturbed natural spaces somewhere in Southeast India, and should be considered critically endangered. As Czech writes in his article about the species for the Journal of the Bombay Natural History Society, the recent discovery of Furaculus furaculus in southern India, previously thought to be confined to Ceylon, and a new, if cryptic, shrew species in Ceylon itself, does allow one to hold out hope for the survival of Diplomesodon sonnerati. Let the search begin. In 2002, Mark van Roosmalen, a Dutch primatologist, was performing research in the Rio Araucazinho Basin in the Brazilian state of Amazonas. As part of his research, he regularly consulted with local people to find out what they were encountering in the forests. In September of that year, one of the tribes he was consulting with had something strange in their possession. It was a complete skull of a recently killed male manatee. That, in and of itself, wasn't strange, as the Amazonian manatee was known from the region, and the local people hunted and consumed them on occasion. What was strange was its size. The skull was nearly 3 times smaller than the skull of the Amazonian manatee, but there was a simple explanation. This may have simply been a juvenile Amazonian manatee. But van Roosmalen wasn't convinced. The molar teeth on the skull were worn down, much like the molars of an adult manatee would be, and far more than the molars on any juvenile should have been. Van Roosmalen was convinced that there was more to this skull, but he wouldn't find any more evidence of a new manatee species until 2 years later. In 2004, van Roosmalen was visiting one of the tribes he had regular contact with, when one of the men surprised him with something. He had captured an adult male manatee 7 kilometers from the confluence with the Aripuanã River, and it was still alive. When van Roosmalen saw it, he was confident that this was the same type of manatee as the one he had a skull for. It differed from the Amazonian manatee in several ways. For starters, it lived in a very different environment from the Amazonian manatees. While Amazonian manatees prefer deep, slow-moving white or black water, these small manatees seem to prefer faster-moving, clear water streams that were quite shallow. As a result of having much more sun exposure, they had developed much darker skin than Amazonian manatees. When compared to juvenile Amazonian manatees, they also were far less bulky and more streamlined. The animal they had captured weighed 60 kilograms and measured 130 centimeters long, and it had a white patch on its chest. It also had short flippers, which couldn't reach its mouth. This was quite different from Amazonian manatees, whose juveniles have flippers that are able to reach their mouths. When comparing the skulls side by side, the difference is even clearer. On the left is an adult Amazonian manatee skull. On the right is a juvenile Amazonian manatee skull. And in the middle is the skull of the dwarf manatee Van Roosmalen had collected. Especially when compared with the juvenile skull, there are clear differences in skull length and the wear on the teeth. Van Roosmalen needed to know definitively whether this was a juvenile or not, so he built an enclosure in a stream and observed it to see whether or not it would grow. In the first 4 months, he didn't observe any growth, and the animal ate vegetation supplied to it without any issues. But around the 4-month mark, it escaped and could no longer be observed. For the next 9 years, the exact location of the wild population eluded Van Roosmalen. Then, in 2013, he conducted an expedition by canoe with a colleague, and they found what they believed to be the last existing population of dwarf manatees in the wetlands situated along the northern branch of the upper Rio Arauzinho. They found several manatees there, foraging in shallow streams, and they estimated that the total population was likely no more than 100 animals. They took DNA samples to compare them genetically with Amazonian manatees, and were shocked at what they found. The two were a match. Despite clearly inhabiting different environments and being morphologically different, they seemed to in fact be the same species. But how could this be? Van Roosmalen had some theories. Firstly, he felt that the dwarf manatees likely split from the Amazonian manatees fairly recently, no more than 485,000 years ago. While this split wouldn't be enough time for major genetic changes to occur, it would be enough time for dwarfism to happen. In the late Pleistocene, a group of mammoths got stuck on the Channel Islands, off the coast of California, when the ice melted. Within only about 5,000 years, their body size had reduced by about 65% in response to being stuck in a smaller space. Van Roosmalen hypothesized that some Amazonian manatees once got trapped in shallow, clear water streams, and over a few thousand years, they quickly adapted and shrank in size in order to survive. He also hypothesized that there had been some gene flow between the dwarf manatees and the Amazonian manatees in more recent history, accounting for their similar genotypes. But if the two species could in fact interbreed, would this not mean that they were still the same species? I am not going to get into it in this video, but there is a lot of debate about what constitutes a species. The general accepted definition is a group of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring under natural conditions. So, while lions and tigers can produce offspring, their offspring are generally sterile. But there are scientifically accepted exceptions to this rule. For example, polar bears and grizzly bears can produce offspring that are in fact fertile. Yet, we accept both species as separate and valid. Van Roosmalen argued that the dwarf manatees had become so isolated ecologically that they essentially didn't have natural opportunities to interbreed with the Amazonian manatees. Coupling this with their extreme morphological differences, he felt that instead of making them a subspecies, they should in fact be described as a fully separate species. He submitted his findings to the scientific journal Nature for peer review, but his conclusions were rejected. Then, in 2015, he submitted his findings to Biodiversity Journal, and his paper was finally published. Despite being published, the dwarf manatee is highly disputed. Many scientists believe that the genetic research speaks louder than all of the other data, and that on this alone, the dwarf manatee cannot be accepted as a legitimate species. Others disagree. It remains disputed to this day, and the IUCN doesn't recognize it as legitimate. If it is its own species, time is running out for the dwarf manatees. With their tiny population size and zero protected areas within their range, it may only be a matter of years before they're all gone. And that's it for today's video. What do you think? Is there any validity to the species we heard about in this video? Or do we need more evidence? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, then join us on Patreon. The link is in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.